The average American can do very little insofar as digging communist espionage agents out of our government is concerned. They must depend upon those of us whom they send down here to man the watchtowers of the nation. The thing that I think we must remember is that this is a war which a brutalitarian force has won to a greater extent than any brutalitarian force has won a war in the history of the world before. That you can talk about communism as though it's something 10,000 miles away. Let me say it's right here with us now. Unless we make sure that there is no infiltration of our government, then just as certain as you sit there in the period of our lives, you will see a red world. Anyone who has followed the communist conspiracy, even remotely, and who can add 2 and 2, will tell you that there is no remote possibility of this war which we're in today, and it's a war which we've been losing, no remote possibility of this ending except by victory or by death for this civilization.
It was a time of national paranoia in which the greatest power on earth expended its energies hunting for communists under every bed, in which millions of average Americans looked fearfully over their shoulders, wondering whether they would be tapped next to explain themselves before the grand inquisitors. It was a decade of upheaval in the world. Age-old colonial dynasties were crumbling before a new wave of nationalism. Ancient regimes were toppling in revolution. And so it was a period when the experts in government were needed as never before. And it was precisely at this time in America that many of these experts were exiled from government.
2 voices. The first, a celebrated one some 15 years ago, celebrated in the most nightmarish, horrendous way, Senator Joe McCarthy, whose voice, whose nuance, whose lifted eyebrow terrified a nation. A cowardly moment. The second voice, that of Fred J. Cook, one of the best investigative journalists in the country, reading the first passage from his book, The Nightmare Decade, The Life and Times of Senator Joe McCarthy, Random House, the publishers. In hearing Senator Joe's voice, Fred, I know you spent 2 years on this. Mr. Cook, by the way, is remarkable. He's written a book, The FBI Nobody Knows, The Warfare State, has won National Newspaper Guild Awards, Haywood Broun Awards for his very gallant, might I say very courageous work, and too little rewarded and recognized. So we come to the Nightmare Decade, hearing the voice of Joe. These are the Army hearings of '54. First thoughts come to your mind?
Well, the thought of this, of this voice, the menace in it, in a way, the timbre of the voice itself, I think explains something of the effect that this man had on a whole nation. He made a nation believe what he wanted the nation to believe, really.
But didn't he come, though, at a certain time, a right time for him? Isn't this the point?
Oh, he did, yes. He came at a time when, when everything seemed to be going wrong. Studs, after World War II, we had thought we could live in peace for a generation or more. Russia seemed to menace Western Europe. Russia suddenly had the atom bomb, which we thought we could keep our own secret for 10 or 15 years, and then China fell to the communists. And it seemed that everything was going apart in the world, everything was going wrong, and many people who thought that this great and powerful nation could not possibly suffer these defeats unless there was some explanation, unless we'd been sold out, we'd been betrayed, we had been sold down the river by subversives in our midst.
So somebody had sold out China. It's ironic that this conversation taking place now as President Nixon is about to visit Peking, and of course we think of the 25 years exposed by the Pentagon Papers. McCarthy used something in his way, 20 years of treason, meaning the FDR years.
That's right. He called the whole entire Truman and Roosevelt administrations 20 years of treason. And he even capped that at one point by saying that every member of the Democratic Party bears with him the stain of a historic betrayal. I mean, we were all traitors if we were Democrats.
But Fred, don't we have to go deeper into this? How come McCarthy did it? Don't we have to go into the death of Roosevelt and the beginning of the Truman administration?
I think you have.
As the Pentagon, your book is connected with the Pentagon Papers directly.
Studs, I think you have to go even back beyond that. As a newspaperman, a young newspaperman, I remember very vividly the reaction after the election of 1936, when Roosevelt carried every state in the nation except Maine and Vermont. And the very wealthy industrialists, the powers of the old order, the shock to them, I think, was incredible. It's hard to visualize. Immediately after this, they began a great propaganda campaign to try to tar the Roosevelt administration with the red dye of Moscow. It was a campaign against what they call foreign isms, which was a catchword of that day. And this went on. It went on unceasingly. Millions of dollars were poured into this campaign. Some of the wealthiest people in America backed this kind of propaganda, and it went on through the entire period of World War II, until finally, in the aftermath of the war, while Roosevelt lived, little of it caught on. He had a matchless gift of ridiculing his opponents, making them look like pygmies, telling a joke about his little dog Fala as if this was the only thing that they could criticize him for, And so they could get nowhere while he lived. But after he died, and in the disillusion of the post-war era, then the fires began to catch. And the climate was built for McCarthy.
I think we should point out the Truman administration played a role itself in the building of McCarthyism.
Yes. You see, the elections of 1946 were really pivotal elections. They were the election in which Richard Nixon ran the Pink Sheet campaign in California against Jerry Voorhees and was elected to Congress. Karl Mundt was elected. There were some very strong right-wing people who were elected named in this election, and the cry of communism in government was being constantly raised. So in 1947, Truman instituted a loyalty program in which his purpose was to try and show that he was more vigorous than anybody else in chasing communism.
This is the Attorney General's subversive list.
Yes.
And this include, I don't know how many organizations it would be.
Anybody, any organization that the Attorney General, in his infinite wisdom, they decided was not entirely patriotic or was subversive in some way, went on the list. And there was no legal recourse to this. There was no arguing with this order.
In your book, Fred J. Cook, my guest, and the book is The Nightmare Decade, the story of Joe McCarthy, Random House publishes. In your book, you point out a very interesting conversation between President Truman and then the FCC commissioner, who was appointed by Roosevelt, a man I know, Clifford J. Durr, one of the few who stood up to McCarthy. And he says, you're playing his game, and it's not going to... See, Truman's excuse was it would stop Parnell Thomas, head of HUAC at the time.
That's right.
And Durr's reply was...
Now, Durr went to the White House and saw, as he wrote in a letter to me, he went to the White House and he saw Truman. He protested against this because he said, look, you're opening the door to all kinds of things here. And Truman said, well, if it gets out of hand at all, I'll stop it. But I just don't want, I want to take the play away from the opposition, in words. But as Durr wrote to me, he said, after the 1948 election, in which the cry was being so constantly raised, in which it was raised to a new level, then there was no turning back. It just went on and on. And
then you make McCarthy respectable. That's the very point.
That's right.
Then you're in his ballpark.
You're in his ballpark.
By his rules.
You see, as soon as you take the other guy's ammunition and you try to outgun him with with his own broadside, you're destroying yourself. You're admitting that there's some basis in what he's saying, in essence. This is what you're doing.
In a sense, it seems to me that your book, Nightmare Decade, is so directly connected with Pentagon Papers. It's remarkable. That it's direct connection.
Yes.
That the loss of China, as though Owen Lattimore, who, if anybody knew China, was Owen Lattimore,
That's right.
who was considered one of the number one spies by Joe McCarthy. We'll come to that in a moment. Had we listened to Lattimore, a wholly different view, isn't that the point?
Yeah, Studs, when the Pentagon Papers came out, the question was raised, well, how could our leaders have been so wrong? How could they have been? But I think Kerry McWilliams of The Nation answered this very well in a recent editorial in which he said, how could they have done anything else? They had created a climate in this country in which facts did not matter, in which experience and knowledge did not matter, in which the only thing that mattered was how strongly anti-communist you were. So you were boxed into a situation in which you dared to go in only one direction.
I think there's something that, Fred Cook, you point out in your book that's terribly important. Just to pinpoint McCarthy as the villain, the sole villain, is of no meaning whatsoever.
No.
And you quote R.H.S. Crossman, the British journalist who became an MP, I believe, in 1954. And this is Mr. Crossman writing of America at the time. It is only the joiners and opinion framers who supported the New Deal, Republican Spain, and the Russian alliance that get it in the neck when the Americanism of yesterday becomes the treason of today. Those who suffer are the civil servants, journalists, radio and television commentators, and trade union officials in exposed positions. And for them it was the Hiss case, not the activities of Joe McCarthy, which was the real disaster. Hundreds of thousands of American liberals felt themselves on trial along with Hiss, and all of them, apart from the few who still believe Hiss innocent, share a sense of guilt now that has been proved guilty, which inhibits not only free discussion, but free thought as well. This sense of guilt may partly explain the eagerness with which so many have jumped on the anti-communist bandwagon. Since they're no longer certain that their previous views were right, why not seek safety in conformism? And then Crossman points out that leading liberal Democrats adopted the tactic trying to outdo McCarthy, that Senator Hubert H. Humphrey upstaged McCarthy of introducing a bill, and we should point this out, to outlaw the Communist Party, and that Senator Paul H. Douglas, the Illinois Democrat, who had fought so many valiant battles on behalf of the common man, had given the measure of his fullest support to McCarthyism in a sense. Crossman interviewed Douglas, and here is the remarkable comment by the gray eminence of Illinois liberalism, quoting Crossman. When I asked Douglas about this measure, he replied very fiercely that the Republican Party does not really want to destroy the Communist Party. They keep it in existence, he said, and use it to smear Democrats like myself. We liberals must destroy the communists if this dirty game is to stop. And asks Crossman, is it unfair to suggest that his attitude is not unlike that of the Germans in the late 20s who tolerated Jew-baiting in order to preserve the Weimar Republic?
Yeah, this is the point, Studs. And you come into the McCarthy era, after he spoke at Wheeling, after he took the floor of the Senate on February 20th, 1950.
You give us the historical basis.
All right.
Wheeling, West Virginia.
Wheeling, West Virginia, February 9th, 1950. Joe McCarthy was a little-known junior senator from Wisconsin. He had a very poor record in his first term in office, which was going to be over in 2 years. He'd become known as the lobbyist boy in Washington, the water boy of the real estate lobby, the boy from Pepsi-Cola.
The Pepsi-Cola kid.
Pepsi-Cola kid.
You pointed out also his war record was a phony one.
His war record would not, he was in the war, but his war wound was not a war wound. It was occurred in an accident on a shipboard. And so he needed an issue if he was going to be reelected in 1952. And at a conference in Washington, dinner with some friends, they latched on to communism. He said, that's it. So he went off to Wheeling, West Virginia, and he made this speech in which he said, I hold here in my hand names of 205 communists who are still active in making policy in the State Department. Well, this was a shocking figure, and it was so specific, you see. 205 communists were still active in making policy in the State Department, that it seemed incredible that a senator of the United States would make it if he did not actually have in his hand 205 names. Of course, McCarthy had nothing of the kind, as became apparent. He didn't have any 205 names. He didn't have any list of names.
Of course, your book becomes, it's revelatory but horrifying. This issue right here, when he was in Wheeling with 205, and later on he said 57.
Yeah, but a couple of days later it changed to 57,
and then he went
it
down
changed
to 81.
To 81.
The horrible part is nobody said you are an unmitigated liar and scoundrel.
No.
No one said it. By this time, the anti-communist fears and psychosis overwhelming.
Studs, one of the most revealing things to me was the scene in the floor of the Senate on February 20th, 1950, when, after the Wheeling speech. Now, the Democrats had had time. They'd had over 11 days in which to bring themselves abreast of what he had said. And he took the floor, and he said that he had 81 names. Well, he fumbled up his papers. He apparently had never really read what he had before. He repeated some cases. Some cases he said specifically were not communist cases. It was the most disorganized, diatribe that was ever put on. But not a Democrat, except the late Senator Brian McMahon of Connecticut, really challenged him. McMahon challenged him on the real point. He said, look, I was in the Justice Department. I have read these records of informers and so forth. And it's perfectly easy to get, the greatest garbage against an individual, and then when you check it out, there's nothing to it. Isn't this possible that this is what you've got, you see? But no one else really challenged him. He sat there in silence.
You can turn to almost any page of Mr. Cook's book, and you're just overwhelmed with shame, of course. We will come to the present moment, too, toward the end of it now, where there can be a recurrence of McCarthyism. But throughout, he was, in the early days in Wisconsin, his buddies in the Army and others considered him something of a buffoon, didn't take him seriously. But when the psyche of a land is such, the buffoon becomes the mentor of our culture, then the arbiter of our morality. Then,
yes, Studs, unfortunately. Provided that buffoon has behind him the pressures of powerful money and powerful newspaper publicity, both of which McCarthy had. And with this kind of public relations gimmicks, you can change a buffoon into a statesman almost overnight.
See, what's remarkable about your book is in the very beginning, when you go to early days of McCarthy as being elected judge and as judge running for senator, which he could not do legally but did, you put he was able to play upon the cowardice of others, blackmail continuously, but even in his local campaigns, Wisconsin campaigns, and then later he was able to do this. This is the point, wasn't it?
Yes, it is. The point, well, I think I've made the point that we Americans like to think we're a great nation of stand-up guys, the courageous people. But when you come up against a thing like this, we find all of a sudden that there are very few people who are willing to stand up. And I think Joe Rao made that point, the Washington attorney who handled a lot of the loyalty cases of this period. He said, he said, people tell me that the Germans were terrible for not having stood up to Hitler. And he said, I find that very few people stood up to McCarthy when McCarthy could do a lot, couldn't begin to do to them what Hitler could do to the Germans, but few people here stood up.
Ed Murrow, of course, was...
Ed Murrow was terrific.
That was the exception among commentators, and you say McMahon among senators. Well, I noticed later on, after the Army hearings, there was a 54-1 vote to renew funds for McCarthy, but only one dissenting vote.
Only one man stood up, and that was Senator Fulbright.
That's Fulbright.
And this was in 54, after he'd done so much damage.
But going back to the early days of McCarthy, and again, this connected with our feeling, the fear of the moment, the fear of that menace. He was running for judge, and one of his opponents was a divorced guy. And McCarthy goes to him and says in his voice, quite sincere, he says, divorced men make poor male candidates. Sorry you would have to heat of the campaign to bring up the details of the matter, to have it spread over press and radio. He wouldn't want to do it, really. And, of course, the guy withdrew.
Yeah, sure.
So this is the basis.
This is the basis of so much.
And yet, we have to come to our country and that time. The opposition to McCarthy was on the defense now.
Completely on the defense throughout the period.
And so instead of challenging him and calling him a liar, they said, now, wait a minute, and they backtracked. And here you have a speech. This is before Truman appointed Senator McGrath as his Attorney General. And McGrath loved this speech in 1949. Perhaps you should read this, by the new president of Georgetown University.
Yes. This is a speech that, if you believe in the Bill of Rights and you believe in the what I call the American system, then a thing like this horrifies you. He said, "It is not surprising to note that states have found it necessary to control opinion exactly as they found it necessary to control economics. The state's thinking in this matter is much sounder than that of the resentful individual whose opinion is controlled. Despite the dramatic but puerile dictum of Helvetius, that there is nothing essentially sacred about an opinion. In fact, in the field of religion, where God has been merciful enough to reveal the truth to mankind, opinion can be blasphemous. At best, opinions are blind groupings for the truth. At worst, they are stubborn vaporings of ignorance. Actually, an opinion is grounded on nothing but the limited experience and personal interests of the individual. It is not supported by a universal, eternal, immutable law as is truth. The state's opinion, then, is just as good, just as sacred, and just as accurate as the individual citizen's opinion or the majority opinion of all citizens. With man's normal aspirations reduced by university training from a thirst for truth to the spawning of opinion, there is every reason to expect that the state, for its own preservation, will be forced to establish an opinion control bureau. There are definite forewarnings of such a necessity."
That's pretty terrifying.
Now, Studs, this is, good Lord, I think the framers of the Constitution would have to be whirling in their graves at a man who would make a statement like this.
This particular comment, though, was inserted in the Congressional Record by Senator Howard McGrath,
yeah,
who liked it.
Who liked it. He approved it.
And that's when Truman appointed him Attorney General.
Truman appointed him Attorney General.
To show that he could, out McCarthy.
Yes.
So, obviously, McCarthy could not have gone as far as he did alone.
No.
This is the point, isn't it?
The point is that McCarthy, a junior senator from a little state like Wisconsin, state of little political clout, could not have done this unless he had powerful support across the spectrum of American establishment and American politics.
The irony is McCarthy, as a senator, I'm thinking of him as the lobbyist, the errand boy for Lustron.
Yeah.
You mentioned Allied Molasses, the sugar lobby, and Toby was furious with him, and his speculation, and no one challenged him. They were afraid because he could use the other technique.
Yeah, you see, all of this was on the record, and yet no one took it up, and no one, either on the Senate floor or even in political speeches, they didn't attack him on these things.
And we come to his sources. As he held up those papers, of course, the celebrated phrase, "I have in my hand."
I have in my hand. He used that time and time again.
I have in my hand. By the way, it's a phrase that's, just a moment ago, you read that speech of that president of Georgetown University in '49. Not too removed from General Maxwell Taylor saying that certain things we know,
That's
the
right.
public need not know.
That's right.
And I have in my hand, originally Illinois senator, used the same phrase as welfare clients who do not merit welfare. Mm-hmm. He has in his hand names of thousands of these clients. So you're really writing about now as well as then, aren't you?
I am, Studs. I think the same thing is there. One of the things in the Vietnam War that so infuriated me was Nelson Rockefeller, for example, who was supposed to be a liberal, a Republican.
He?
Well, he was supposed to be.
Oh, huh?
Who was saying, well, I don't know about it. They tried to get him to comment on the Vietnam War. Well, I don't know about this. Only the president can know. Only he has the information. This isn't what our country was founded on.
Yeah. I'm thinking of the people who challenged him in the very early days. There was a woman, by women's lib would like this. One of the earliest was Judge Dorothy Kenyon, who called Joe McCarthy an unmitigated liar, a coward, and she devastated him when he accused her of being subversive. She destroyed him. You would think this elderly woman then would have had some support.
No, nothing. The significance of the Dorothy Kenyon thing was that he was before the Tidings Committee. He was supposed to support his charges of 81 communists, which he'd come down to now in the government. And then you'd think that the first name he brought out, the prime case, would be the strong case. And who does he name? He names Dorothy Kenyon, who was a city magistrate in New York, who had never had any close connection with the State Department at all. She served on a United Nations Commission for the Welfare of Women or something like this, which is not a policy-making thing of any kind. And he denounced her. Well, she charged down to Washington. She was a very gutsy lady, and she took the stand, and Joe conveniently was not there.
He wasn't there when she showed.
Oh no, he didn't show when she came and denounced him, and she put her record on the line, and there was no answer to this. The Republicans on the committee themselves admitted after they had heard her.
Well, that comes the horrendous part. We think of Senator Robert Taft as a man of ethics. Indeed, he, by relatively speaking, ethical. Yet he said to McCarthy, though he put his, what's the phrase he used?
If one case doesn't work, try another.
And that was it.
That was it. And so if one case didn't work, you tried another. You went to something else. The Dorothy Kenyon thing didn't work, so you accused someone else. And it went on this way. And McCarthy had a genius of always topping the story that folded with a more sensational headline, you know?
So even though he was the bully boy, it's the respectables who used him.
That's right.
It amounts
Exactly.
to that, doesn't
Exactly.
it?
Studs, one thing I've said here, which I don't think you'll find anywhere else, is the fact that he was not alone when he went to Wheeling in February 9th, 1915, peddling this line. Guy Gabrielson, who was then chairman of the national chairman of the Republican Party, made a similar speech in West Virginia on the same Lincoln Day tour. The Republican National Committeeman from West Virginia made another speech in Charleston, West Virginia, on the same lines. The only difference between these people and McCarthy was that McCarthy was the only one who had the nerve to stand up and say, I have here in my hand a list of 205 names.
Before we go to the most celebrated of all the cases, and this concerns us today, and China and the Pentagon Papers, the case of Owen Lattimore, using that as one case, though, of many, but that's the most celebrated. We think of Hyannisport, Massachusetts, the home where the young Kennedys would meet, where Camelot came into being. It was Hyannisport where Joe McCarthy visited Joe Kennedy often.
Yes. And Joe Kennedy admired McCarthy immensely and poured a lot of money into his early campaign against communism, thought that Joe was really going to go places. Poured money into his re-election campaign in Wisconsin in 1952. And after McCarthy's death, Joe Kennedy, whenever he was mentioned, Joe would have tears in his eyes as he thought of his dear friend and what had happened to him.
Well, I think just to keep the record straight, you know, as this applies to some extent to Jack Kennedy and to Bobby Kennedy,
well,
too.
Bobby Kennedy, too, always seemed to feel more sympathy for Joe than he did for the victims of Joe. I mean, this, I think, is very clear in what Bobby said about him.
Yeah. The patriarch Kennedy clan, this is when, who came to visit them? Someone came to visit Gardner Jackson.
Gardner Jackson, yeah.
Gardner Jackson, as a Washington employee, came to visit Joe Kennedy Hyannisport with dope about McCarthy not being that great a guy, and stormed Joe Kennedy, trying to ruin Jack.
This was in the congressional campaign when Jack was running for Congress, and Gardner wanted him to take a stand. He said, "Look, you know, you want liberal support and union support, but now take a stand on this." And Joe Kennedy blew his
And Joe
stack.
said, "You and your sheeny friends trying to ruin my son's career."
Yeah.
It's like, shall we say, a slight touch of anti-Semitism here.
Yeah. Slightly, yes.
And so, we come to Bobby as the attorney for McCarthy committee during the hearings, and when McCarthy died, this is Bobby's tribute. He got so involved with all the publicity talking about Joe McCarthy. Number one thing in his life was on a toboggan. It was so exciting and exhilarating as it went downhill. It didn't matter if he hit the tree at the bottom. I felt sorry for him, particularly the last year of his life when he was such a beaten, destroyed person. I liked him, yet at times terribly heavy-handed. It's the most unusual use of phrase. He was very thoughtful of his friends. He could be cruel to others. And as you point out, Bobby showed few signs of equal compassion for the victims.
No,
of
he
Kennedy.
didn't. His sympathy was all with McCarthy. And
I suppose, in
endured.
fairness, your own observations now, there were there changes taking place? This is a question continuously asked in the two young Kennedys.
Well, yes, Studs. I think that the remarkable thing about the Kennedys is the tremendous capacity they showed to change and to grow. For instance, you take Jack Kennedy's presidency. I thought the first year was a disaster. And I thought the third year before he was assassinated showed great signs of his advancement, of his being a great president in the end. I think the handling of the missile crisis in November 1962, if it hadn't been handled the way he and Bobby handled it, we probably wouldn't be sitting here today.
And yet, wasn't the missile crisis political rather than military?
It was, yes, but it was probably military too. And if he had followed the advice of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and charged in and blown everything in Cuba apart, Lord knows what would have happened.
Because the big thing is, would they have been changed? That's the question, of course. We know the Pentagon Papers indicate that there was a role here, a not too good one, played by the Kennedys. So we have to come, don't we? Not a question of heroes now or archetypal villains. Not that at all. It's a question now, isn't it, of the psyche of a land, what can happen to a people.
That's right.
When hysteria takes over. It's a study in hysteria, really, isn't it?
It is, and that's one of the things to me. I got a little footnote in the book. One of the remarkable things to me was the role of the Hearst newspapers in this thing. They supported McCarthy. They masterminded some of his moves throughout this period. And then 20 years later, looking back, the Washington Bureau of the Hearst papers ran a story written by the chief of the Washington staff with the help of his staff, in which they looked back with horror upon this whole episode and said that it must never happen again, that McCarthy was a demagogue who had forced an entire nation into panic and hysteria by looking for communists under every rock. And they quoted William Rogers, as Secretary of State William Rogers, as saying that the State Department was just now recovering from the damage that he had done it 20 years before.
We're going to come to that very point, the irony, the incredible irony of now and then, and the role of the press, too, at the time, and the case of Owen Lattimore and China, and now, in a moment. We'll pause for a moment. Fred J. Cook is my guest. His book is The Nightmare Decade, The Life and Times of Senator Joe McCarthy, Random House, the publishers, and it's, to me, this is absolutely must-reading if we don't know anything about our country, how we think and how we fear, and perhaps how we can recover, too. In a moment, we'll continue. So we pick up the conversation. I haven't had any booze yet, but I'm drunk with reading your book. Fred J. Cook, It's the Nightmare Decade, The Life and Times of Joe McCarthy. Some generation ago, and yet is it a generation ago? And so we come to the newspapers, the time. Today, we see, happily, New York Times and the Washington Post and the Boston Globe and the Los Angeles Times and perhaps some Chicago papers, perhaps, taking a stand. What was the position at the time when McCarthy was in power?
The position at the time when McCarthy was in power, Studs, was, well, I can only describe it as tape recorder reporting. He was a senator. Whatever he said made a headline. There was no tendency to look behind the headlines. There was no tendency in the press to analyze this man, to explain what he was. He went on for about almost 2 years before any of the media began to really take a look at him. Then the Progressive out in Wisconsin, his home state, did a real takeout piece on him. Time wrote an unflattering piece about him. And gradually, a few of the newspapers began to examine this, but for so desperately and tragically long, until the damage was done, really, and this myth of the man had been created. There was nothing except what I call tape recorder reporting.
Yeah, this is interesting. Tape recorder and something, and that's called objective reporting.
Yes, that's objective. You see, where I get criticized for is they say, well, Cook isn't objective enough. Well, how can you? I try to get my facts straight and I try to make them accurate, but the facts tell a message, and I think it's a job of a writer to tell a message too.
This is a point. This set of Fred J. Cook, of Nicholas von Hoffman, of reporters of this sort, whom I happen to admire, whom I call advocate journalists, because everyone has a point of view, no matter who or what he says. You were a police reporter for many years, by the way. Fred Cook won the Haywood-Broun Award for a tremendous series in New York. And as most police reporters used to get the stuff in the police blotters, didn't they?
That's right.
And that's objective reporting.
That's objective reporting, because there it is. You can pick it up, and that's it. But to me, the job of a journalist is to dig into the roots of things, if possible, and to follow that trail of truth as far as you can follow it. And then when you find it, present it as hard as you can.
So we come to McCarthy's perhaps most glorious moment, in quotes, and that's the case of Owen J. Lattimore.
Yes.
Suppose you begin and talk about that. That concerns now us and China at this moment.
It does concern us in China very much. Let's preface it this way, Studs. The Far Eastern Bureau of the State Department at this time, before the McCarthy era, was adjudged by most governments, not just our own, but other governments around the world, to be one of the most expert bureaus that existed. Many of these people, Owen Lattimore was one, were sons of missionaries or businessmen in China. They'd been born in China. They knew the language. They knew the people. And their knowledge of China and Southeast Asia was invaluable. One of the amazing things to me, I went back and read one of the books that Lattimore wrote at this time. I think it was in 1949 it was published, in which he said, right at the beginning, all Asia is in revolt. And this is something that we are not going to be able to fight with conventional weapons, because these are people who live off the land, who can fight in their own way. A perfect description of what happened in Vietnam over 20.
His own Lattimore calling the shot 20 years.
Calling the shot way
Yeah.
ahead of time. You see. All right, now we get into the tidings hearings in which McCarthy has to put up or shut up, and he brings in various names, and he's not really getting anywhere with them. Like the Arthur Kenyon case, it collapsed. But he begins to whisper mysteriously away from the hearing room, off record, that he's going to name the #1 Soviet spy in America. He's very cozy about it at first. He won't give the name, But of course, as soon as you begin to whisper this, the newspaper men think, what is the name, Joe? Give us the name. So finally, in confidence, of course, he confides that the #1 Soviet spy is Owen Lattimore. Well, once you confide this to a room full of newspaper men, even though it's off the record and in confidence, somebody is going to find a way of using it. So they go around to make an in-play, and they suggest that the man that McCarthy is describing, his career fits what is known about the career of Professor Owen Lattimore, you see. Eric Sevareid gets on CBS News and uses this rather cozy approach, among other, things. So Lattimore's name suddenly gets into the paper by hook or by crook as a #1 Soviet spy in America. And then McCarthy now is riding the crest of new headlines. The fact that his previous charges have been discounted makes no difference, because he now has the #1 Soviet spy that he's trading on. Well, Lattimore was not a man to take his lying down as so many did. This little professor charged back full of fire and brimstone, and he tangled with McCarthy.
The iron is, didn't he save a number of Tibetans from
Yes, he did.
China, if I recall.
In the midst of this, before Lattimore even got home, Drew Pearson broke the story that there were anti-communist Tibetans whose lives had been endangered, and Lattimore had hoped to get them out and was even then sheltering them in his home in Baltimore, and sponsoring them in this country. This was a deed of a man who was this a deed of a man who was a communist, a dedicated communist? No. The fact was there. The action was there.
I'm thinking of two kinds of reportage that in your book here is very interesting. Drew Pearson, flamboyant, and who publicly on radio at the time said he defended Lattimore, challenged McCarthy, and the intellectual Sevareid, who was very cautious and safe, who, ironically enough, is the narrator of the McCarthy film that D'Antonio did, the McCarthy Army Hearings, Point of Order. He's the narrator of that. So this guy never loses.
No.
But he's an objective journalist.
But this takes a kind of skill, that I guess I don't have.
I know you don't, fortunately. So I want to come to the China. This is so directly. James C. Thompson, you point this out in the footnote of your book, Mr. Cook's book, the chapter, The Case of Owen Lattimore, the book The Nightmare Decade, in the Atlantic Monthly of '68. How could Vietnam happen? And writes Professor Thompson, it was a legacy of the 50s, which I mean the so-called, quote-unquote, loss of China, the Korean War, the Far East policy of Secretary of State Dulles, and the whole man, and of course the attack on men who were given the real dope, that Asia is not the Asia of the 18th century, that colonialism is dead, and that they can, the guerrillas can live off the land. And this is the quote, and of course McCarthy took care of all those people offering this information. And Felix Green later on, another footnote, Felix Green points out the people who are backing as a result of all this, continues with Chiang Kai-shek, the others, Oziem, it goes right down the line. Pearl Buck speaks of Green's book as very revelatory.
Yeah.
But this is so related again, is it not, to McCarthyism?
Well, it is, because you see, again, we come back to the point that there was nothing left. Nobody dared speak out or offer a dissenting view. Now, I swear you cannot get sound policy in this country unless you can get a free interplay of ideas and knowledge, unless people feel free to speak. One thing I've cited in the book, Studs, Professor Paul Tillett of Rutgers University, who has since died, made a survey of this time, and one official of the State Department told him in 1960, one high official, that for 8 years the State Department had not received a single opinion from a foreign mission that disagreed with policy. In other words, we were being told by the State Department in Washington what the people in the field knew would be palatable, but we were not being given any dissident view at all.
So I'm thinking there was also a survey taken. Think about ourselves. Now it comes to the man on the street. And there's an Elmer Davis story here, which is pretty terrifying. Before that, the surveys. In 1951, 15% were pro-McCarthy, 21 anti, 63% no opinion.
Yeah.
That, of course, is significant. 63, so not to have an opinion.
Yeah. And then you see another shocking thing. Several newspapers did this. They went out on the streets with quotes from the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, and they asked people, would you sign these, subscribe to these sentiments? And people were horrified. You could ask 100 persons, and maybe one of them would subscribe to these sentiments. The rest of them thought they were communist propaganda. Well, it's a horrifying thing.
So people would not sign the Bill of Rights.
No, they wouldn't sign the Bill of Rights. They wouldn't. They wouldn't. Quotes from the Declaration of Independence. They didn't.
So this was called. We call this period the silent 50s, the silent generation. As a result, 63% no opinion. It's horrendous. Elmer Davis tells a story, helps explain it. Where was Elmer Davis? It was after the war, and Elmer Davis, who was a man of undoubted courage, reading his story. You want to read that? In Houston, the Houston story.
Yeah, this is I think, typical. This is Elmer Davis writing. In Houston, a man and his wife, she a radio writer, were sitting in a Chinese restaurant talking to the proprietor about a radio program which they hoped he would sponsor, a program dealing with recent Chinese history. A man who overheard them rushed out and telephoned the police that they were talking communist. So they were promptly arrested. What they were said to have said, whether they did say it or not is not clear, was that Chiang Kai-shek was fighting a losing battle. That may or may not have been true, especially depending on whether it means his hanging on in Formosa or reconquering the mainland. But true or false, it was no evidence of communism. Yet this couple spent the night in jail, 14 hours in jail, before the police finally concluded they had nothing on them and let them go.
So the 63% no opinion, the incident, the trauma of this couple, and then how people can become suspicious of one another and inform on one another too.
Yeah.
This is the horror of it.
This is another evil which still goes on. The whole informer system, the whole informer syndrome, Studs, the idea, one of the horrible fine things that goes through this whole period was the way the government protected its informers. This was sacred. This national security depended upon guarding their identity. If you were accused in your job, whether you're a butcher or an electrician or a plumber or whatever, you had no right to know who accused you. You had no right to see any of the evidence against you. You had to defend yourself in boxing in a fog, as it were, because the informer was protected. Now, this is contrary, again, to all American tradition. It's contrary to any sense of justice, because, the malicious neighbor, the guy who is jealous or doesn't like the way you comb your hair or whatever, can tell any story he wants, and he is protected.
So the only reason McCarthy really lost is that he overshot his hand. He attacked the army.
Oh, yeah, he could have gone on probably forever, but he began to collide with elements of the establishment. And this is when he got into trouble. He collided first with the Protestant clergy. When J.B. Matthews, whom he had brought to Washington and made his chief investigator, wrote an article in which he said that the Protestant preachers were agents of Moscow. This was the first time he collided with an element of the establishment. And then he collided with the army. And of course, when you collide with the army, you're really colliding with a power complex.
You talk about ironic overtones. The army then, the army now. It's remarkable. McCarthy never telling where he got the dope, and General Maxwell Taylor saying it now. He just it was a boner, tactically speaking. Nothing to do with ethics and morality. There's nothing to do with the case at all. But tactically speaking, it was a boner. And of course, he met Joseph Welch there in contest. And we come now to perhaps what the book is all about: the legacy of Joe,
Yes.
the legacy of McCarthy today. And the Pentagon Papers, of course, relate to that. We come to now the question naturally to ask Fred Cook, as he was one of the best investigative journalists in the country and observer of the scene, is could it happen again?
Studs, I think it could, but I think the I think the man and the hour, as they say, would have to meet at the right juncture, as they did when McCarthy spoke in 1950. If we had a terrible depression in which everything seemed to be going apart, if we had some, as we did then, some great foreign menace which seemed to be about to engulf us, and people were scared and paranoid, and then you had a man like this, yeah, I think it could happen again, because, and the reason I say this is that when Vice President Agnew spoke at Des Moines in November of 1969, the first attack he made on the media, people I knew became wild-eyed. I walked into the news store where I'd been getting my papers for 20 years, and the proprietor said, "Did you see that last night? Did you see that? Wasn't he terrific? There is your next president, buddy boy." And all of a sudden, the feeling erupted. The legions that McCarthy had are still with us. And if the well can be tapped at the right time, it can be done.
Perhaps it have to be a different form, though. What would the young today accept the name-calling as being the sign of that person's disloyalty, as then people did?
No, probably not. I think probably not. But there are these great tensions in our society. There are the tensions of the blue-collar worker. There are the tensions of people who feel threatened by the thrust of the Negro into the cities. The middle-class person who is just about making it, who feels himself menaced. These are the kind of people who are open to this kind of propaganda.
We haven't mentioned the professors. It's rather interesting. Professor Colgrove of Northwestern became one of the intellectual supporters of McCarthy, and we naturally think of Rostow, we think of Kissinger, we think of what went on in Vietnam. And just as you speak of the irrationality of it, too, of the fear, you point out here the reaction to the Chicago Convention. Though people saw things on television, they did not believe what they saw, but rather what they wanted.
That's right. That's right.
That, too.
Yes, you see, it was all turned around. What they saw on television did not convince them.
But you know what perhaps is the most significant passage in your book that can surprise you and was frightening is young Tricia Nixon's comment about Agnew. And here we come. The evil that men do, suspension points, is the last chapter of the book of Fred Cook. And the young girl is quoted, the young daughter of the president. The mood at the top was perhaps most frankly expressed. This is after Agnew's attack.
Yeah, after Agnew had been.
It was expressed by Tricia Nixon. In an interview with United Press International, she exulted. "The vice president is incredible. I feel I should write him a letter. He's amazing. What he has done to the media, helping it to reform itself. I'm a close watcher of the news, papers, and TV. I think they've taken a second look. You can't," and here's the phrase, "you can't underestimate the power of fear. They're afraid if they don't shape up." The power of fear. A young girl says this. The power of fear. And she says it glowingly.
Yeah.
Afraid if they don't shape up. And so we come to the one emotion, don't we, that it pervades this book and pervades almost any society when hysteria takes over. That is fear, isn't it?
Fear, yes. The fear, the refusal of people to stand up and be counted, Studs. This is what makes a man like this possible, an age like this possible.
The fear also of being called a name if you do stand up.
That's right.
And the question is, who authorized him? That's a question Joe Welch asked, I think, during the Army. Who authorized him? That's another one, too. This book has farcical overtones in a macabre sort of way throughout. We speak of this clown figure, a clown figure, and yet the clown figure becomes this horrendous, overwhelmingly terrifying figure.
Yes, and the shocking thing that a whole nation ran scared, and persons' lives, innocent people, their lives were damaged, ruined at times.
Of course, this is the aspect we haven't touched on in our conversation, the scores of thousands of lives, as well as reputations that were ruined, whether it be teachers or whatever they might have been.
People in every walk of life. This is the thing. The thing went down to everyone who was in a defense industry, everyone who worked connected in any way with anything, having anything to do with the government, whether they had any access to secret information or not. If a job was just putting in plumbing or electric wiring or carving up meat on a ship at sea, if they were accused of this kind of thing, they could be out of their job and on relief practically.
Another part we haven't touched, the celebrity aspect of it, the beautiful people courting him in certain circles, just as I noticed Agnew parties on the coast, whether with Sinatra and with Reagan and with John Wayne, and the beautiful people are all there, you see. And here it was Mrs. Basie Miller of the Washington Times-Herald, Mrs. Basie Patterson Miller, the charming, what she had a column called The Charming People.
The Charming People,
and among them there was the fating of Joe, because in a sense he was celebrated, was he not?
Oh yes, he was, and he was fawned on by these people, and he was admired by these people. This was what they wanted. He was the man they could use to get back into power, or to get what they wanted and wished.
Well, perhaps you should end with you're reading the last paragraph, which is about now. Fred J. Cook is my guest. The book is The Nightmare Decade, Random House, the publishers. And it's the subtitle, The Life and Times of Senator Joe McCarthy. Might I add, the life and times of my and Fred Cook's generation. And, of course, young people. A lot of young people don't know who McCarthy was, do they?
When I wrote the book, some of the younger generation, you say Senator McCarthy, they think at once of Eugene McCarthy, in the campaign of 1968. But this is another Senator McCarthy.
You have here, in that foreword to your book, there is a new generation of young Americans, many of whom have only the vaguest idea about Joseph R. McCarthy, what McCarthy of the 50s represented. And they think of Gene. And then when you ask, what about Joe? I don't know much about him. But the last paragraph is following the 1970 elections and the attempt again to use a slight touch of it.
Yeah.
And didn't quite work out. You're happy about that, but then you end.
Yes. If there was cause for congratulation in this, I'm talking about the result of the 1970 election, there was also cause for worry. What was appalling was that the old and discredited tactics of Joe McCarthy had been trotted out and tried again with frenzy and desperation by the highest officials in the land. And in the aftermath, there were no signs of shame, only these spurious claims of victory. There was no guarantee that the same techniques would not be tried again and again, until through some fortuitous combination of circumstance and crisis, the spark caught and rekindled the flames of the nightmare decade. Had our leadership learned so little? Could it all happen again? Hell yes, said Joseph Rao, and that possibly in itself is enough to make any American shudder.
Well, the question is, can it? This is, of course, we say in World War II, situation fluid. Very fluid indeed.
Yes, and I think, the combination has to be right. But what makes me fear is that the kind of passion that this man tapped still exists. And the hate syndrome that this propaganda buildup in the nation exists. And any time the Kennedy assassinations, for instance, the reaction to this in some quarters absolutely horrified me. People who are decent, appearing American citizens, leading solid and respectable lives, will tell you about the assassination of Jack Kennedy. Well, it was a tragic thing, of course. But if that was the only way we could get rid of him, it was a good thing.
You heard that point out that Fred Cook was doing
that is terrible.
Some remarkable reportage at that time, too. So you're talking about that aspect of our psyche, which neighbor is pitted against neighbor, and the fears are there. Fear of that stranger, we come to that again. Fear of that outsider, fear of that alien thought, fear of that which is different. And out of it could come a Joe, but need not, which is the aspect of it. That's why a book of this sort is of such importance. It sort of describes the symptom of an illness and it analyzes the illness, and it's clinical and dramatic and powerful in its description. That's the work of a journalist in open society. Fred Cook fits that description beautifully. The Nightmare Decade is his book, subtitled Life and Times of Senator Joe McCarthy. Random House, the publishers, and it's quite available. Thank you very much, Fred.
Thank you, Stan.